Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Zdeněk Šmergl, and this event is organized by Amnesty International Osaka, which is a part of Amnesty International Japan. We are going to be talking about current protests in Colombia. Our main speaker is Cesar Marin, who works as a senior tactical and crisis campaigner for the Amnesty International Americas. And he is joining us from Mexico City. Before we start, I would like to shortly introduce Amnesty International and our groups here in Japan. As you may know, Amnesty International is focused on the protection of human rights and was founded in 1961. Currently, Amnesty International works in more than 70 countries around the world. Main office here in Japan is based in Tokyo, but you can also join our English-speaking regional groups in Osaka, Nagoya, and Tokyo. Here you can see information about Amnesty International Osaka Multicultural Group 95. You can check more details on facebook.com/Amnesty Osaka. Our next group, here you can see some information about Amnesty International Multicultural Group Nagoya. You can check more details on facebook.com/AIMCG Nagoya. Our colleagues in Nagoya are preparing a very good podcast called Rentaikan, so you can try some interesting topics and listen to them. Next group, please, it's the oldest English-speaking group here in Japan, and it's called I-10, Amnesty International Tokyo English Network, and it's based in Tokyo. You can check more information on their website, which is i10.info. Please feel free to contact any of these groups, and you can become a member of Amnesty International and participate in protection of human rights. Okay, now we can return to our main topic, and please remember that we have opened the chats on our Facebook and YouTube, and you can start sending us your questions. Now I will pass the mic to our guest, Cesar Marin.
Thank you very much, Zdeněk. It is a pleasure for me to join in this conversation, not only because of the topic that we're going to touch upon and the importance on the issues that we are going to talk in a little while, but also because before being here in the Amnesty International Secretariat Americas office in Mexico, I've been for a long time activist of Amnesty in a section, and it is always reminding me the powerful nature of this organization when I talk to people, activists around the world who form groups and who are there no matter where, standing up for human rights in all the corners of the world for all people suffering human rights violations and promoting a world where we all enjoy human rights in every corner of the world. So it's always a pleasure for me to talk to activists and to have the chance to share a little bit on the work we do in order to make this world better. As you know, and we can go to the presentation right away, if we might. As you know, we've been in the Americas, we've been passing through many situations, critical situations, as we call it, crisis situations that have been, taking place this year. And one of the most prominent ones has been the situation in Colombia. I decided, as we are going to kind of move forward in the work that we are doing in Colombia, to title this presentation that in Colombia, hope is punished. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm the one in charge of the presentation. Yes, sorry. Okay, so the next slide should come. Just let me know when you see it. You can see it now. So why we are talking about Colombia? On the end of April, the government started or promoted a tax reform. This tax reform was kind of framed in a way that was needed to respond to the consequence of the COVID-19 pandemics, and in terms of, particularly in terms of economical burdens posed in the country. As you know, the pandemic's been with us for over a year. In many countries, the conversation has been about, how to prevent the disease to reach out to our borders, how to decrease the impact on the health on the people, and the toll of deaths and suffering in terms of, or from a public health perspective. In our region, sadly, which is one of the most unequal regions in the world, these conversations had not only been on the health situation as such, but also on the social and economic consequences of the pandemic. And because all our countries have been passing through very complicated economical and social balances throughout the recent years, and most of the countries have been really struggling to cope with the demands for a better life from the people. And in this context, the Colombian government decided to put forward a tax reform that will be imposing more kind of constraints towards the middle class and and some others in the society. And this was regarded as kind of a last drop in the glass for many other things happening in the country, which they were not in agreement with. So in that sense, the reaction, the natural reaction from the society was to took the streets. They started on the 28th of April, and the call was for a national strike, paro nacional, to happen from that date onwards, in order to make a clear stand against this measure and to other measures. We're going to talk about the reasons behind the protest later on. But the main point here is that we are talking about Colombia because people stood up and they said, enough is enough. We are not taking this situation like it is any longer, and we need to raise our voices to demand respect to our rights, particularly to economical, social, and cultural rights. And we're going to touch upon this later, but most of the demands have a lot to do with the fact that people are not able to make ends meet. People are not able to enjoy a public health system that is kind of providing for them, and they are not able to enjoy and exercise and kind of going up in the ladder of progress and in the ladder of well-being in general. And this is taking me over the next point. Most of the people taking part on this protest and these demonstrations are young people from marginalized communities living in poverty, and young people being Black and being indigenous. These are the voices, the most prominent voices that we have been hearing for over a couple of months when protests took place in a more prominently way. Protests are still kind of taking place in the country, but not in the size and in the scale that were taking place in a couple of in April, May, and some bits of June. And the most important, I believe, element to this is that the message from the young people, from the young Black indigenous people, marginalized for centuries in the history of the country, is that we want to have a future. The future is us, and we need and we want to have a future. And the third element, and of course, nothing of this would be happening if the government wouldn't have a very violent response to this protest. Instead of kind of start listening, understanding, and put forward proposals in a way that allows people to speak out and to receive, in the case of the government, ideas or comments on how best to solve the crisis derived from the many years of economical kind of unsustainability, but also the COVID-19 impacts. They decided to go after the people protesting, and they decided to exercise excessive violence on them, and the response was basically one of repression. And these have had devastating effects. We as Amnesty, we tend to work particularly on the human rights impact of any situation. We do work for the human rights to be enjoyed and lived by everyone in the world. And when we see these kind of situations in which people rise up and demand action from their governments and from their states to solve the situations they are facing. When we see these kind of situations, what we really want to see is positive actions from government, and sadly that is not happening like quite often. In the case of Colombia, as you see on the slide, the effects of the repression and the violence exerted from the state is really, really devastating. There are at least 28 persons who died because of illegal action of the public force. In here we count police officers shooting with guns and live ammunition. It is a bit of a technical wording, but it's, the weapons that kills. So we saw, and we had cases of police officers shooting at people peacefully protesting, and killing them. We have seen police officers shooting what we call less lethal munitions. We are calling here about rubber bullets or tear gas canisters and other kinds of means in which they are supposed to reduce and isolate the actions of persons this is from the eyes of the police and the military. But what they do is that they use it in a way that is so badly used, completely against any standard of international use of force, and completely against any guidance that regular law enforcement units should be using this kind of equipment that provoked the death of persons. And we have seen also the use of armored vehicles to pass through the bodies of people. So these are kind of the illegal actions involved, not all of them, but some of the legal actions involved in these deaths, which are kind of the ultimate punish for people demonstrating on the streets. We have around 300 persons that we don't know where they are. They were going out to participate on the protest, and they never appeared again. Some of them, some of these 300 people, we don't have any information even on who they are, but these are kind of a account that is being put forward by civil society organizations in the country, and even the human rights and prosecution institutions in the country, official authorities in the countries. Sorry. Very sadly, we have 28 cases of sexual violence, mostly committed against women and people from the LGBTIQ plus community. Basically, they were punished in this way, which could amount to international crimes, because they were who they were. So it is not only that there was some sort of a punishment, but the sexual component of the punishment to these people is only because who they were. They were women, they were probably trans persons, gay persons, lesbians, or others. Similarly to what we have seen in other instances in the region, and I do know that you had a conversation about Chile. In Chile, this was very prominent, but we also have seen in Colombia the fact that the way that the police is behaving and the law enforcement authorities are behaving with their equipment that they are being given is so bad that is generating also eye injuries to people protesting. In the case of Colombia, we've been able to, or civil society organizations also have been able to verify at least 81 cases of people losing one or two eyes because of this, the shooting of specific munitions or specific equipment against them, directly to their heads, directly to their eyes. And unsurprisingly, in the course of the protest, there have been over 2,000 persons who have been detained just because they were protesting. Not only, the authorities have not been able to kind of explicitly charge a single action of these people like would amount to a crime, to a regular crime, and they've been detained solely for being in the place where a protest was taking place and being taken illegally by law enforcement authorities. But this is not happening in a void. This is not happening just by a coincidence. The first factor here to understand the situation in Colombia is that this is a deeply unequal society. Several organizations, international organizations, have declared, and after analyzing the situation in Colombia and the whole statistics and all the data available, have regarded that Colombia is the most unequal country in all the Americas. This is to me and for other people kind of understanding this is really shocking. We are talking here that the Americas as a whole, it might be the most, but certainly is one of the most unequal regions in the world. And by having one single country being the most unequal country in the world, in the region, in a region that is kind of leading, sadly, the inequality rankings, then you can see how complicated and how clear the situation is for those taking the streets. They are with a deep understanding that they are really living in an unequal society, and they do know that by raising their voice, they might not be able to come back home safely, but they do so anyway. I mean, they do go to the streets in the middle of a pandemic, and knowing the deep inequality roots of the country, and they somehow were brave enough to say to raise their voice again, and try to make sure that someone listen. Probably not their own country's authorities, but probably someone else in the rest of the world. Most of the, as I told you at the beginning, most of the demands of those protesting were about enjoying economical and social cultural rights. They want a better health system. They want a better education systems. They do want better and effective ways by which the governments put forward policies to ease the effects of the pandemic, in which most of them probably lost their jobs or lost their way of life. In here, it's kind of very important to quote the statistics department in the country. They say that in 2020, 42% of the Colombian population was living in poverty, and that it's about 7 percentage points more than in the previous year. So here you can clearly see the socio-economical effects of the pandemics. And all of those persons, 7 million will be living in extreme poverty, which is more or less a sixth of the whole country population, a seventh of the whole country population. And also, then we have the terrible story of conflict in the country. Colombia is currently, because sadly it is not being solved, in the midst of an armed conflict. The armed conflict started, at least in theory, because of a desire of certain portions of the society to solve the historical and deep-rooted in the history of the country inequality, and that inequality isolated indigenous communities, Black communities, and people living in poverty from the benefits of living in a society. And sadly, the response from some of the people to kind of solve this situation was to took the arms and start an armed conflict with the state. And this conflict lasts until today. This conflict have created much more damage to the civil society, to the people, to the citizens, particularly those who were supposed to be in the first place protected or, benefited from the rise of those groups demanding change with armed struggle. And it is the same people suffering not only from the historical inequality, but also then suffering because of the nature of a conflict in which all the time the civilians, the citizens, are those receiving or suffering the most of it. There were supposed to be some sort of advancements or some forms of solutions to the situation with the negotiation and signing of the peace accords, But this peace accord sadly has been very slowly implemented, when implemented, and there have been many open wounds that cannot be held in a way that is that is meaningful to all people suffering, not only from the conflict but also from the inequality. One element of those kind of issues that by which we do know that the peace agreements have not been implemented properly, and that we are not, and the whole society in Colombia is not fulfilling the promise of healing the historical wounds, is the fact that this is one of the worst places in the world to be an activist. In fact, it is the worst place in the world to be an environmental activist. Only last year, and remind this is a year of pandemics. This is a year where people were not fully on the streets and going after their business as usual. We had 97 killings of human rights defenders, and verified at least 45 homicides. From January to defenders, other civil society organizations have been putting the figure of 135 human rights defenders being killed only because of the work they do, and 65 homicides pending verification. Most of you, and I do know that, and I want to give my gratitude and appreciation from a citizen in the Americas because of the work that you've been doing. Last year in the Right for Rights campaign, we highlighted the case of Hani Silva. She is one of these environmental defenders putting her life on the line just because she wants to be happy and she wants to be living in the place she loves to live in southern Colombia, and this is a kind of very this is kind of a very, very telling characteristic of the country, in the sense that you know that there are people really being targeted just because of the work they do defending the environment, and they nevertheless keep on their struggle because they want to live happy in the place where they belong, and in the place where they do think that they are doing a lot to preserve our existence of all of us in the planet. And finally, a very important characteristic of Colombia is the fact that, we are talking about a country living in very chronic impunity. We had mobilizations in some form of a national strike in 2019, and there were also killings. There were also people disappeared. There were also people being subjected to acts of sexual violence and all of that. And very few law enforcement, police or military personnel have been taken to the courts for being processed and to being accountable to the abuses they committed. There have not been full investigations on most of the cases. There was a very kind of prominent highlighted case of a young person being killed with a shot of a kind of less lethal weapon, and the case was stalled until early this year during the months of the protest. Finally, the attorney moved to pass to prosecution to those officers signaled as the ones who committed and who shot and committed the homicide of this young person. But it's only one case probably, and the impunity around massive human rights violations and crimes against international law have been really a norm in the country, and no one and the system is not working well to put an end to that by prosecuting and sanction those involved in the human rights violations. Are we good until now? Let me take a little water. Thank you, and excuse me for that. So what we've been doing since the beginning of the protest, we've been following closely the situation. We've been reaching out to the very brave and amazingly inspiring civil society in Colombia, and with communities and leaders to receive information and to know what would be the best way of trying to stop the situation being lived by those seeing their rights violated, and also to kind of tackle the structural issues that we've been seeing in Colombia for long. And we've been able to respond very quickly to the initial repression. We've been putting together an urgent action, which is, for those of you who are not familiar with Amnesty, is a very simple way to put out a means to put pressure on authorities by saying very concretely what are the wrongs that the authorities are doing in the context and how they can solve the situation, so people can write to them and exert some pressure and demand accountability from authorities. We've been able to put a video showing the ways in which the authorities were exerting excessive force on people protesting. We've been putting together an open letter for the President of Colombia, Mr. Ivan Duque, demanding to put an end to repression, but also kind of responding to the social and historical demands being formulated by those protesting, and also kind of enabling civil society organizations from across the world to express solidarity to victims and or other organizations, partner allied organizations in Colombia. And with these contacts and with these actions, what we've been kind of conveying is the message of guaranteeing the people's rights to protest. People should be able to freely express their opinions and to freely go to the streets and say, we are not going to accept this or that. That's a right. And what we are saying to the Colombian authorities is that they, instead of attacking, they need to guarantee that this right is exercised fully and properly by the people. Secondly, we've been demanding a full stop on repression. Repression has no place in contexts where people is expressing their opinions, particularly when there are very strong demands for restitution or kind of enjoyment of their economical, social, and cultural rights. And also, it is a violation. The repression itself, the use of excessive force, is a violation or derives in very serious violations on other rights of the people. So we've been calling for a full stop on repression. We've been also calling for authorities to remove the military presence in cities and rural areas. Sadly, the very initial response from the government when the national strike was being called was to deploy the military. Most of the time, the deployment of the military have consequences on the human rights of those people protesting, and it's quite often the case in which those violations are never seen or taken by any authority in terms of justice, reparation, and guarantees of non-repetition, not talk about truth. And The other couple of demands that we've been putting forward is the full and comprehensive reform of the police. Even the constitutional courts in Colombia in 2020 called for a comprehensive reform of the police. We are talking a police institution that is being mostly being built and trained and equipped to deal with a situation of conflict and not in a situation of regular citizens taking out the streets. So in a way, it is a militarized policy. It's a policy. It's a police. I'm talking too much about policies. It's a police. We are talking about a police institution that is being built for war situations and to identify enemies and to kind of, deal with enemies in the way that they normally do in the militarized world. And in that sense, it is required for Colombia to really think and going through a very comprehensive and deep reform of the police. And finally, of course, we want accountability, we want justice, we want truth, we want reparations, we want guarantees of non-repetition, and all of that starts by having proper investigations on the cases of human rights violations. So this is more or less, in a glance, the situation in Colombia, what's been happening, why it is happening, the historical roots. But also we do have, and the good thing of being in a movement like Amnesty is the fact that you can do things. You don't only receive the news of bad things going on in a specific country in the world. You also can do something to revert the situation. And the first thing that we all can do, of course, is to sign petitions and, of course, letting know the authorities in social media, but also directly sending an email or anything else, or a regular post, that we are kind of calling for the things that I just mentioned, the 5 petitions, the 5 demands that we have regarding to justice, regarding to the full reform of the police, regarding to getting rid of militarization as a response to people protesting, guaranteeing the right to protest, and also full stopping repression. You can also tell everyone you know about the situation in Colombia. You can refer them to this video when it is posted online, and you can also have a look in the many amnesties outputs that we are producing. You can follow them and promote them all from our websites, from Amnesty Japan website, and also from the many social media channels that we do have. And on this regard, it's very important for you to know that next week, on Friday, well, your Saturday, our Friday, we are going to issue our first in-depth report on the human rights violations that we've been able to investigate and to corroborate in Colombia. This report is going to come with a set of new elements to kind of denounce the situation all across the world, but also with opportunities for you to take action and for getting back the narrative of the need of a future, a better future for all those in Colombia being left behind for so long. In the picture now, you see Erlendi. She is an activist from a community living in poverty in Cali. The report that we are issuing is about specifically Cali, which is an area in southwestern part of Colombia, which being hit the most with the acts of repression and excessive use of violence by the authorities. And she's been working with this community and with the young people, the very young people who are now on the streets demanding change. Erlendi says that it is not a surprise that we've seen people, young people taking on the streets, because otherwise what kind of futures they will have? And this is precisely the message I want to convey in this conversation, that everything we do in order to demand accountability and to demand authorities in Colombia for respecting the people's right to protest is not only because we do believe in human rights. It is also because we do believe in the future of the people in Colombia, particularly the young people that have been left behind for so long. So I will stop here, and I am more than ready to answer your questions and to listen to your comments and to listen to your experience or suggestions on how best to deal with the situation in Colombia. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for a great introduction and presentation. And we have already a few questions we would like to ask. So if you don't mind, I will start with the first one. As you mentioned, Colombia has been recognized as one of the most dangerous countries in the world for those who defend human rights and for the social activists in general. Could you tell us how Amnesty International conducts investigation in this kind of dangerous environment?
Yes. Of course, with the pandemics, we do have a very different scenario, but the regular scenario that we do conduct research in this kind of situation is, first and foremost, we do liaise with local organizations and communities, and we only get in contact with them when they are ready and they are willing to share their stories and their testimony on what happened and how that happened. Colombia is one country in which we can enter to conduct such research in the field right before the pandemics. We are not able to do so right now. But anyways, we can also have the recounts and the analysis and the views from the communities, from local civil society organizations working in human rights issues, from authorities, sometimes human rights, local and regional and national authorities. Sometimes they do their homework and they actually get in touch with the communities, and they do know on first hand the situation on what is going on. And after all of that being analyzed, we also can get in touch with the communities, and we normally tend to have first-hand testimony and first-hand recognition of their situations in the field. The very last time we sent a mission to Colombia, like international mission into Colombia, was in 2018, 2019, and we were digging into the situation of 4 different places and 4 different type of communities being targeted because of the work they do defending sometimes environmental rights and land rights, but all the times defending as a whole the communities and the communities' rights. And the fact of being able to go with them and to show them the recognition they should have and show solidarity is truly important for their struggles. But also when we do have very first-hand information and evidence and analysis of the situation, we are better positioned to produce our reports like the one we are going to issue next week on the protest, and then we are more better positioned to tell the authorities the truth and ask them the demands that we normally ask. In the case of this protest, we've been able to contact very professional and brave human rights organizations working in the country. We also had a couple of colleagues from the human rights community in the field, and they were really keen to produce and to follow our very strict methodology to do a proper recount and a proper collection of evidence and testimonies. And we have taken advantage of this same technology that we are using to get in touch and talk about Colombia. They've been using a lot the means of technology, teleconference and telephones, in order to being able to gather as much information as possible. Prominent to us is the testimony of the victims, the evidence that victims could provide, and also the fact that they are closely they are having a very close relations with civil society organizations in the country. But above all of that, their security, their well-being, the integrity is paramount to us in order to conduct research and also publishing our findings.
Okay, thank you. And I think other question could be, do the results of your investigation show that human rights were systematically violated in Colombia during the protests or in general?
So this is kind of a very important question, and it's always been asked in all this kind of context. It's been asked when we have been working the situations of massive repression to protests in Nicaragua, in Venezuela, in Chile, also in Colombia. And we really need to be careful of separating two things. One thing, and most of the questions are normally going to this element, is that whether or not we are able to say there are crimes against humanity, therefore the people behind the human rights violations and the crimes against humanity should be prosecuted internationally. For that, you should be fulfilling many thresholds and many proofs and many kind of sort of evidence and gathering of information that, have specific requirements. And we are not those as an organization. Amnesty is not the one organization saying that, yes, we are talking here about crimes against humanity and this person should be facing trial in the International Criminal Court or wherever. What we do is to provide the best evidence and the best findings and the best facts that we have. And for having a systematic, preeminent, and kind of overwhelming system violating human rights of a specific group of people, which amounts to these crimes against humanity, you really need to kind of take into account larger and more historical perspectives. In the specific sense of the protests, what we can say is that they were taking place in many parts of the country at the same time. They are similar in the nature of the perpetrators, police persons and sometimes military persons, committing the violations against people peacefully protesting. Most of those people have been identified as young, Black, indigenous, or living in poverty, in communities living in poverty people, and that the level of impunity around the initial actions of these officers is really high. So there are not specific prosecutions and an active kind of behavior from the prosecution and even from the national ombudsman to accompany victims and to kind of find the truth around the violations that happen. And this is really, really concerning. And this is really, really, it's a very terrible situation. If that amounts to crimes against humanity and that we need to get into the courts to people from the president down to the officer who shot at someone, that's something that we can start building up from what we have now. And probably if there are conditions to prove that, we will be saying in the short time, we don't discard the fact that this may amount to crimes against humanity. But at the present time, what we can say is these violations are terrible, have happened all across the country, having a devastating consequence on the people protesting just for raising their voice. And the perpetrators are very clear. And we do need to have better and strong the prosecution should be, the national prosecutor should be really having and starting a comprehensive, profound, and quick system for investigating all of them, in order to kind of making clear that these are not going to end in the back of impunity.
Thank you. Another question could be, for example, Colombian military and police have a long history of human rights violations. Can we trust Colombian authorities to investigate violations of human rights? You were already mentioning the impunity, which is widespread in Colombia. Could you touch a little bit this topic?
I mean, it's the same situation happening on all countries where we do see human rights violations, right? How are we expecting the authorities to actually go after the very persons who are in their same payroll, in a way, in the same system? The fact is, it is an obligation. And by not fulfilling that obligation, the state, in this case, will show or will give elements to think that they are not either willing or capable to do so. And in that sense, will require, and they should be asking for international support to conduct such investigations and to provide justice for victims, truth, justice, reparations, and guarantees of non-repetition for those people demanding it from their government. If they are not able or capable or willing to do so, then this is one of the characteristics that are being added to the file of things that the country and the states are not fulfilling, and probably will be one of the elements to kind of label the situation as probable crimes against humanity, because the reigning of impunity and the deliberate attitude towards impunity is really an indication of whether or not the state is fulfilling their obligations internationally. Colombia has been a signatory of all international instruments and standards regarding access to justice, trust, and reparation, and also on several of the most egregious and grave human rights violations. And by not fulfilling their obligations, they are also indicating that they are part of the problem and not the solution.
We have questions via chat. Under what way are human rights defenders and protesters under surveillance, especially digital surveillance by the police and other state authorities?
So yes, what we've been able to kind of check is that at the very beginning of the protest, there were internet shutdowns, which are becoming very common on the region. The authorities are thinking that, by shutting down internet, the protests will go away, as if there was the only way of organizing protests or, kind of maintaining the pressure on the authorities on the streets. The other thing that we've been able to and these cuts of the internet were duly exposed and denounced globally, and they were stopped right away. So right after the very 2-3 days in which we and other organizations noted the internet shutdowns, and many organizations went public about it, then the shutdowns disappeared. So that's a very interesting element of analysis there. Secondly, we've been receiving some information about possible targeting of certain leaders of the protests or people identified as main drivers of the protests in certain cities, but this following is not being done through technology, but old school, kind of police going to their on the nearbys to their homes, or where they work, or where they have this, or if we're talking about a civil society organization where they do have their offices, or the whereabouts of the people who are very clearly and publicly leading the demonstrations, or leading organizations exposing the abuses by the authorities. So it's very old schools. We haven't seen many, or we haven't seen evidence of technological use of means to follow people. But again, it is about of receiving the enough evidence and the right evidence, and we cannot discard that this is happening.
Okay, thank you. And following question is President Ivan Duque announced on this Monday that some reforms to the national police. Among these reforms is included, for example, new uniforms and human rights training for anti-riot officers, probably the SMAT units. Do you have any information about these changes, and do you consider these changes as adequate, or are they just cosmetic rather than honest effort to find a solution?
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned the SMAT. SMAT is an acronym of it's a very specific unit to deal with public disorder, quote remarks situations. The curious part of this squadron is that they are being deployed when there are not public disorders, but people peacefully protesting. And SMAT's being signaled as one of the main SMAT officers being signaled as one of the most egregious perpetrators of human rights violations in the country. And it is important that if any reform of the police is happening in the country, SMAT should be part of it, and a very specific part of this reform, not only concerning on receiving training on human rights, but also in the way that the officers in this unit are accountable for what they do, and they are very rapidly taken into the courts and receiving sanctions for what they do. In terms of the general question on the police reform, it's important to note that this reform is being called by the national courts, not by the government. Last year, the courts submitted a decision, a position in which they demanded the authorities to conduct an in-depth reforms of the police. And this hasn't happened, and there were no signs for this to happen until the repression and the demands for accountability were added to the many other demands, the social and cultural and economic rights demands of those protesting, because the repression was so prominent and the human rights violations were so pervasive that at the end, the actual repression was added to the list of demands and the reform of the police. So in that sense, the government is just doing what they have to do, which is to follow the court's orders to conduct a national in-depth reform of the police. We haven't seen so many details about it. Normally when they announce these processes, in the experience throughout the Americas, when governments announce these processes, are kind of very adamant to say how positive these are going to be. But as they say in English, devil's in the details. And in this case, the actual actions for changing the police are yet to be seen. And of course, we're going to be very ready to try to get more information to understand the level of the level and reach of these reforms, and to be able to convey messages on how best to and how to make it better, because definitely this is something what we need in the country, not only in Colombia also, because I'm very sure that when you talked about Chile, this issue also came about, and this is a regular permanent issue in the region. Sadly, we are not having a police that is actually there to defend the rights of every citizen, but to sometimes or most of the times in critical situations in the context of protest to sadly abuse the rights of the people.
So as you mentioned, the police and military role, could you please a little bit touch on the topic of the so-called false positives scandal in Colombia, what it includes, and just to explain a little bit for our viewers what this scandal is about?
Thank you for the question, because that allows me to expand a little bit on one of those open wounds from the conflict that I mentioned. And I didn't touch upon this, basically because we cannot touch upon anything. But false positives is a practice by the military and the police to kill people out of nothing and then implicate the dead people into crimes or into criminal groups or into the guerrilla in the context of the conflict, or to paramilitary groups. So you basically get a person, you kill them, or you do many other human rights violations onto them, and then you signal this person to be part of the enemy, whomever the enemy is. And in Colombia, and this has been particularly a result of the very inspiring stories of communities and relatives standing up for the memories of their lost ones. For many years, they've been struggling against the enormous apparatus of the Colombian states to claim that their relatives or their loved ones were not criminals, were not guerrilla people, were not paramilitary, were not narco gangs involved persons. They were regular citizens who one day they were stopped by authorities, officers, law enforcement officers, and then they were disappeared, they were killed, they were tortured, and they were then presented as criminals being taken down by the authorities in their marvelous operatives to restore peace and or the rule of law in the country. And the fact is that courts have been following several cases, and some cases have been more or less resolved. But even very high-rank authorities in the military and even the former president Álvaro Uribe are implicated in a court proceeding because of these so-called false positives that happen mostly throughout. It's been happening kind of all the decades of conflict, but these cases are mostly from the last 20 years. So it is one of the sad indicators and characteristics of Colombia. It's not only happening in Colombia, but in Colombia was so prominent and so extensive and so kind of palpable in a certain period of time that it was really one of the most terrible situations that we've seen in a human rights situations within a country in the region, in the Americas.
Thank you. And other question this time would be focused on the judiciary system. How independent are courts or judiciary system in Colombia, especially focus on these protests, for example? Can judiciary be trusted in general or specifically in this kind of protest situation or dealing with the protests?
It's a relatively independent justice system if we compare with the very worst cases that we have around the neighborhood in the Americas. If you see to just next door to Venezuela, then you will see that you don't have really a very independent and reliable justice system. In Colombia, you might have some room in terms of the justice system to believe that there is something that there will be some cases being taken forward and all of that. I just mentioned one case that is going forward on false positives that probably in other countries in the region will not be taking place at all. The main question here is, to me, and for people working on Colombia, is not the level of reliability of a given justice system alone. It is the level of commitment from the human rights authorities, the National Ombudsman, for example, to be able to stand by the sides of the victims as it is its mandate, and no matter what the challenges are, stand for them, with them, and accompany them in the whole process of getting justice. It's about the prosecutor, the national prosecutor, starting investigations, enabling information gathered by civil society to be part of the processes, and also having the victims and the relatives as the first and foremost source of information and testimony, and protect them. And also, finally, then when it gets to the courts, for them to have all the resources and the time and the protection for doing their work freely, because we really need to remind this: the courts and the judges really need to be as independent as possible of any kind of pressure, and conduct their work with taking care of looking at the law and the evidence, and providing justice for the people who are claiming justice. And in that sense, what we think that is important is that the whole system implicated into a possible human rights violation works in the way that they should be working. In the case of the courts, being totally free to make their judgment, adjusted to the law and to the facts, in the sense of the ombudsman and the prosecution and the national prosecutor to do their work on accompanying victims, relying on victims, protecting victims, and enabling civil society organizations to be part of the processes too. And for the authorities in the institutions being signaled as human rights violations perpetrators is to be open, transparent, and being able to separate and not defend as in kind of a one standing hierarchical unique position the every officer in their institutions, but being able to accept that they might be or there are persons, more than one, committing abuses, and in that sense they have to be open, transparent, and willing to cooperate, and not to impose barriers to justice.
Thank you. And here is a question. What information do you have about the number of cases of injured police officers? Are these serious cases, or is it government over-exaggeration and just using these kind of cases as a possibility to distract attention from
No. There have been really serious cases of police officers being injured. Sadly, sometimes this is referred to the fact that they are being sent to these kind of situations with the proper equipment and training for dealing with the situation. Sometimes this is because of they were into a situation that they couldn't control, and we've been saying, and we are adamant to kind of reaffirm that most of the protests have been peacefully conducted by people on the streets, but that doesn't mean that all the protests and all protesters have been peacefully exercising their rights. In those cases, police should be fully and properly trained and equipped to avoid being victims of any kind of injured or any other worse situation. We do seriously get the information from authorities about the number of officers being injured, and we do hope that they recover very quickly, and we do hope that they are supported in the right way from the authorities in order to get through their situation. It is a very concerning situation in some cases that they were just exposed to a scenario in which they were not really properly trained and equipped. But in any case, we don't take those kind of information as a way to kind of disrupt the situation that's been disrupt or to counter the situation that's been faced by those taking the streets and those people protesting, because they've been really hit hard by the excessive use of force, and it's an obligation from the state to both protect their own workers, the police officers and the military, and also protect the people protesting, and it's also human rights obligation. If the governments and the authorities are trying to put this narrative of the number of officers being injured or somehow affected by the protest, they are going to find themselves in a very difficult situation to explain why there are so many officers in this situation, when they should be able to kind of deal with the so-called violent protests, which haven't been taking place mostly in the country, and how they are providing the right support to those officers. But one thing that is important to mention here is that part of the strategy from the government is stigmatizing and criminalizing the actions of the protesters, and sometimes they might be using this narrative of police persons being injured in certain instances as a way to justify indiscriminatory actions against people protesting. And in every person who have studied a little bit the ways in which you need to deal with actions of peaceful protests becoming a little bit violent, with certain persons in the protest becoming violent, or protests being completely violent, they will tell you that the most important thing here is that the authorities, the law enforcement officers, are able to identify the violent person in the crowd, and they should be, it's an obligation, they should be protecting themselves, of course, but also other people protesting from those executing acts of violence. And that obligation probably hasn't been fully met in these cases, and probably also the fact that the police being so poorly trained and properly equipped to deal with this situation have been in a way exacerbated by the calls from the higher authorities, calling the people protesting crooks, parts of narco gangs or guerrilla or paramilitary groups, trying to seed a chaos situation in the country, to overturn the government, or to kind of getting down the whole system. And what that creates is a scenario in which the scenario which we have seen mostly, that is a scenario in which the police feels the obligation, feels the moral support to go after people peacefully protesting just because. And that's something that we're not gonna kind of sustain or to accept. We are very willing to recognize that most or some police officers probably were doing their work properly, and because of that they were sadly injured or affected, and that's something that everyone in the world will be very sensitive to. But not using that as a way of saying that you really need to go after every protester in the country, because the obligation from the authorities is to protect both the protesters and those who are working in order to preserve and sustain the right to peacefully protest.
Okay, thank you very much. And following questions would be focused on regions of Colombia. Regarding the Amnesty International research, is it possible to say that in certain cities or regions, police treated protesters differently compared to other cities and regions? For example, you already mentioned Cali. Comparing treatment of protesters in cities like Bogota and Cali, or in the whole regions as Amazonas or Choco region, for example, if you could touch a little bit in detail about this topic.
So what we have is that we have different sources and different ways of checking the information and accessing the information. What we've seen, for instance, is that the shootings of the so-called bullet rubbers, or kind of pellets, the shooting of canisters of tear gas, and the use of and the kind of extensive use of tear gas, and kind of the beatings of people, is being pervasive all across the country. The level, the intensity of use is being different in certain parts of the country, but the actual kind of behavior from the authorities, the law enforcement officials, it's been more or less the same all across. What we do know, and that's kind of purely because of the facts, is that most of the people being killed, for instance, in these situations of protest by illegal actions of the officers, are in the area of El Valle del Cauca, where the city of Popayán and Cali are located. And this is an area of interest to us because we've been receiving lots and lots of denounces of human rights violations and other criminal actions against the international law. So this area is of particular interest to us, and that's why we are issuing our first report, focusing mostly on cases that we've been able to corroborate in Cali and the surrounding areas, which are located in El Valle del Cauca. But there are cases all across the country, Zdenek, and the problem is that it's so pervasive, so extensive, that you cannot claim this is not a pattern. You cannot claim somehow there is an understanding at the very least, or probably a specific command to inflict this damage. And from that onwards, we don't know what else we could be able to prove in the future. But at the very least, what we can say is this is not kind of a one isolated incident of a specific unit or 2 or 3 specific officers in a very limited time. What we are seeing is that this probably is a part of a bigger problem.
Thank you. And questions from chat. The protests had been paused for some time. What is the current status of the protests, and what could be the outcome or outlook following days or following weeks?
So there have been some protests after kind of the high peak of the national strike. The national bigger strike was paused, but there have been some other protests taking place in several rural areas and cities, mostly because of the presence of the military in certain areas, and mostly because of the lack of progress in the human rights violations, investigations, and things like that. But we cannot properly say that everything stopped. What we have seen is that the protests have been in scale and in number. They have been reduced, definitely. There is a moment in which the national because the national strike was having kind of a collective conduction. They are kind of in conversations / negotiations with the government. We are not really kind of into analyzing what they are discussing and what is the kind of level of solutions that they are being providing. What we are really into right now is to kind of get as much information, evidence, and analysis as possible for keeping up the demands of accountability and justice, truth, justice, reparation, and guarantees of non-repetition for the victims of the abuses committed during the peak of the protests and during the weeks that protests were more prominent. And we'll see whether or not the human rights accountability and the end of impunity are included into these conversations / negotiation. I do hope that this is taken very seriously by authorities and the national kind of coalition leading the national strike. And we are going to be carefully looking at this situation and following up and seeing whether or not this is they are providing good actions, concrete actions for the victims and relatives.
Thank you. And following question from chat again. How sensitive is the Colombian government and police to pressure from abroad, for example, from Japan? What Japanese people could do specifically?
It is very sensitive. Historically, the Colombian government has been really promoting itself as a government that is embracing multilateralism, that is embracing the place of Colombia in a global community, that is promoting business within Colombia and promoting Colombia as a place for doing proper businesses. So in that sense, it's very sensitive to the international pressure, not only from kind of the Americas, as you will say that, of course, United States and countries like Argentina, Brazil, or countries in Europe, but also from countries in the Asia Pacific region. As to what extent is that level of pressure? Well, of course, we don't know, but I'm very sure that, for instance, and you might provide more examples, I'm pretty sure that the Colombian authorities in Japan has been very responsive to the actions that you've been delivering to them. And probably they've been kind of responding to the urgent actions being received by and other petitions being signed by activists, and they've been actively responding to that because they do really feel and they do really want to show their country a country that is not violating human rights, a country that is kind of modern and open and behaving in the way that a good country will behave. So in that sense, I do believe that it's very sensitive, and I'm pretty sure that you will be activists in Japan probably have received replies from the embassy and the section and groups working on Colombia probably have been invited to the embassy to talk and discuss the situation in Colombia and to exchange views. And sometimes the embassy and authorities wants to convince Amnesty that, we are a little bit exaggerating on what is going on, that is not true, and all of that. That's part of their work that they have to do. But we do have the evidence. And then with the evidence, they cannot do much more than say, well, put yourself to work and make sure that you fulfill what you are saying, put your actions behind put your words behind put your actions behind your words, and make sure that this is not happening again and people are receiving proper justice for what is going on. So in that sense, I do believe there is a lot that people in Japan can do and will be influencing if they are engaging in actions on Colombia.
Thank you. We will definitely follow these options, and we will try to put some pressure here from Japan. And another question, if you don't mind. Similar social protests movement in Chile led to process of creating a new constitution. Do you think this possible outcome or some positive outcomes could come also from the Colombian protests? So far, Colombian government is, let's say, very strict and negative towards any kind of positive solution. Do you see there any options, any possible positive outcomes from these protests?
I do tend to believe, as an activist as I am, that every time that people rises, they are in itself, that is, and that means a positive change for the societies when those protests happens, because that means that people are not tolerating anymore the wrongs, and they want to expand the rights of what is going on. In the case of Chile, the demand of a new constitution was having a lot of time in the making, and even the governments were proposing a way of dealing with the problems of the constitution from the end of the dictatorship, from the end of the military junta government. And I believe that the protest of 2019 in Chile, what they did was kind of, in a very exemplary way, showed that the people were not taking it anymore like the regular responses and the lack of action from all authorities, not only the government, but all state authorities on the many shortcomings that the Constitution had, and the many demands the people were crying out for change. In that sense, I do tend to believe that in the case of Chile, the kind of process leading up to the Constitution is important. Let's see and let's hope that it's coming with positive change in terms of ensuring the rights of the people, make sure that the human rights are at the core and at the center of the new constitution, and that all people can truly believe in a country that promotes and make sure that people are taken care of. In the case of Colombia, what we hope is that at the very least there is justice, a process that ensures justice for the people who have recently been receiving kind of being victims of the actions of the state officers, and that there is a very in-depth work in the police, so that these things are never happening again, and importantly, for the demands of the population to be addressed. In Amnesty, we don't care about the way in which those demands are addressed, but what we care is about the demands to be addressed. In this case, because the demands are, all of them, very linked to the human rights obligation of the states, being that the full protection of human rights defenders, social leaders, and activists, being that the guarantee of justice for atrocities committed in the past, being that full accountability to those in the line of command at the higher level for the abuses that happen in the story of human rights violations in Colombia, being that proper access to health services and a proper access and a proper fulfillment of the right to health of the population, the right of education, and the respect of the lands and the lives of the people in the rural areas, particularly the indigenous communities and the Black communities. So in that sense, this is what we expect. Whether we get it or not, time will tell. We are going to be very closely following the situation in the country and supporting and engaging with the communities and the inspiring and brave civil society in Colombia that's been working so hard for their dreams and their rights to be respected and fulfilled.
Thank you. And if you don't mind to mention more details or about the situation of indigenous communities in Colombia and about the Afro-Colombian communities, if you could a little bit in detail.
Yes, sadly. I mean, we are going to provide links at the end and in which you can review fully, for instance, what we've said about Colombia in terms of our last annual report being issued in March this year. But most of the work done by Amnesty in the last decades in Colombia have been to follow closely the situation of Black communities and indigenous communities. Sadly, these communities have been at the center of the attacks and the disputes from armed groups taking part in the conflict in the country. Depending on the zone of the country, you will have situations in which you have paramilitary groups combating against each other, or within the same paramilitary group, factions having disputes over territory, over businesses, mining, drugs, etc. And these communities are right in the middle of those disputes because they do live in the places where, sadly, they are very rich in sadly not. I mean, sadly because of the situation, but they do live in places where there are lots of natural resources or lots of logistical advantages to conduct narco traffic or narcotic activities for these groups at the margins of the law, paramilitary armed groups like the ELN, the dissidents of the FARC. What I'm mentioning here in the acronyms are mostly kind of guerrilla groups, ELN, FARC, dissidents, paramilitary groups like the AGC, the Gaitanistas, and many others. So there are different actors all across the country, and sadly, indigenous community, Black communities are in the middle of those situations, and they have normally been caught in the middle of this conflict that they are not taking part of, and they are not even kind of participating in any way, rather than putting the people being killed, the people being submitted to abuses. And in that sense, for instance, you mentioned Chocó a while ago. We've been working extensively on Chocó, and there have been many situations in the last decades on that, and we've been we produced a report in 2016, if my memory is not failing me, specifically about the depths. Sorry, my English is failing me. It's not my first language. On the depths of the state, on delivering full restitution and reparations to this community, which has been hit hard by the conflict. From one side, from the military and state operatives, but also from the other armed groups involved in the conflict. And we were kind of dedicating our campaigning work and our work closely with the community there, demanding action of protection for the remaining people remaining in the community, and the leaders demanding proper treatments for their lands and protection for their lands, and then the way of life and the means of living, and more importantly, for them to be able to forge their own future. And sadly, if you look at the annual report, and I'm sorry, I'm looking at it because this is something that is always kind of coming into different into different expositions that we do about the country. Is that Chocó in particular is one of the most, if not the most, it's a state where the most disadvantaged state in terms of economics and poverty and these kind of things. And it's a state where there are lots of resources available, and they might be, if properly assessed and by making possible to the communities, Black and indigenous communities, to live along in peace and to take advantage of the resources in the very ethical way that they will use them. They will be in a very different position. But instead, for instance, throughout 2020, we reported that around 23,000 persons, more than 23,000 persons, belonging to indigenous and Afro-descendants communities in that department were confined. So we're living kind of, if they were in a prison, because of the armed clashes between a guerrilla group called the ELN and paramilitary groups, because they wanted to, these groups wanted to control the mining, illegal mining business in the area. So this is kind of a very kind of little glimpse of what is going on there and what is being for them, for Black communities and indigenous communities all along the history, but particularly within the conflict history that sadly is not going away for them. And if people live in these conditions and where you know that you can be killed or disappeared anytime, what else do they have rather than, making themselves to be heard in any way? And what other ways they do have for claiming that they do need, and the state do need to answer for them for what they are living. And in that sense, the reasons for protesting in Colombia and the reasons behind the protest are very legitimate and are not kind of new. They are historical, and you can track them all across the many demands and the many struggles the peoples, particularly the indigenous and Black communities peoples, have been conducting in the country.
Thank you. And I think last question could be focused on the peace process in Colombia. You already mentioned FARC movement, guerrilla, and other movements. 2016 peace deal with the FARC. How are the perspectives? How is the implementation? Because it's one of the part of the protests.
Mm-hmm. So there is a specific group called the CROC Institute. It's one of the civil society organizations we do have contacts with, and we are closely in contact with them. They've been saying that at the very least, the implementation of the peace accords are very slow, very, very slow. And there are many gaps in the implementation of this peace accord. Sadly, this is kind of bringing about many other situations in the sense of that the peace accords were labeled with certain level of reason, were labeled as one way of getting rid of the conflict, and therefore as a solution for very structural problems in the Colombian society. And the lack of proper implementation of the peace accords, what are creating now is a situation in which people, particularly those most affected by the conflict, are starting to think whether or not they were kind of, conned. They were, in a way, lied to, or they were not. So the authorities and everyone else, they didn't tell all the truth about it. Without political willingness to really move forward the peace process and to try to attain peace and get over the conflict, what the authorities will need is a apart from this political willingness, is to show and to kind of behave in a way that people believes they are behind it, because you can sometimes you wouldn't be able to properly and fully comply with your commitments in certain areas of your work, but definitely the attitude and the way in which you can say, well, I'm lagging a little bit in this area, but I'm putting more efforts in this, and I'm gonna try really, and I'm gonna show really that I'm fully for the implementation of the peace accords. Then people will have more, particularly those most affected, will have more confidence that things are gonna somehow get towards a solution. The problem is that the lack of willingness, and even in the own party of the president, the own political party of the president, clear signalements of criticism and challenging, and even depicting the peace accords as part of the problem and not part of the solution to the situation in Colombia, then all of this creates an environment in which sadly people are getting less confidence in the states for moving forward on this, and the implementation of the accords are not showing very good results and strong results in many fronts. One of the fronts that are particularly concerning to us is that one of the points of the peace accords are the protection of social leaders and people participating in communities and people like that. And clearly Colombia is hugely failing on that on that part of the peace processes, and we are really in need of an urgent review of that for making sure that the aspirations of the accords are fulfilled. But particularly because we're talking about lives, we're talking about our colleagues in the Chocó communities trying to make and trying to live in a way that they really need to live, or colleagues on civil society organizations working on environmental rights in other parts of the world. It's our beloved Hani Silva in southern Colombia, defending the bushes and the area giving way to the Amazonas in Colombia, and standing up for the trees and the vegetation and the way in which people relate to that environment too. And we're talking about people being killed. We're real persons. It's not about some letters on a paper. We're talking about the dignity of people. We're talking about the lives of people. And that's why I think that it is truly important to have a very profound review and kind of supercharge the implementation of the peace accords, because otherwise situation in Colombia probably will get even worse in terms of the disputes between the civil society and the states. And if the states is going to respond with violence, then ultimately we will kind of be sadly exacerbating the situation, the dire situation already lived by people in that marvelous country of Colombia.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was a good ending, I think, for our event. So many thanks for joining us. Many thanks for talking about Colombia, and many thanks for answering all our questions. And hopefully we can stay in touch, and for the future we can prepare some following actions or following events.
Thank you very much, and of course, again, my call for you all to keep on engaging, sign petitions, tell everyone what is going on. The resources that we are producing, we are very into providing more and more information and means for people to engage with the situation, and in the hope that this international pressure will bring very positive changes and positive news for our friends in Colombia.
So thank you very much. And before we finish, I would like to thank you for joining us, to our viewers for joining us on our event. And please remember that you all can participate in protecting human rights by joining and supporting Amnesty International or any other human rights organization. Your voice and actions matter. And I would like to thank you and wish you have a nice day.
Goodbye. Thank you.